The rain in Gotham never fell clean. It came down in sheets that smelled of exhaust and old blood, carrying with it the particular misery of a city that had long since made peace with its own damnation. Tonight it hammered the rooftops of Coventry, the borough the locals called the Devil's Mile, where the streetlights flickered in patterns that suggested malfunction, but were actually something older, something that had learned to hide inside broken infrastructure the way rot hides inside beautiful wood. The city breathed beneath the storm, and what breathed back was not human. The dimensional rift opened at 11:47 p.m. between a condemned tenement and a Brimstone Society safehouse that had never existed in this reality. It split the air like a wound, edges burning violet and copper, smelling of sulfur and something metallic that wasn't quite blood but wanted to be. For 3 seconds, it held its shape, a vertical tear in Gotham's wet darkness, and then it expelled its cargo with the casual violence of a universe coughing out something that didn't belong. Rayne hit the alley floor in a combat roll that turned impact into momentum, blades already extended from the leather harnesses across her forearms, her amber eyes cutting through the dark with the effortless precision of a predator who had never once in her long, violent life needed a flashlight. She came up in a crouch, scanning the alley in a single sweeping assessment, cataloging threats with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this since the 1930s. Dumpsters, fire escapes, a dead rat, 3 unconscious men whose necks bore puncture wounds that were already several hours old. She was not the first monster to visit this alley tonight. Rayne straightened slowly, rain plastering red hair to her face, and took stock of where the ritual had deposited her. The Brimstone extraction point had been a warehouse outside New Orleans. Whatever Zatanna Zatara had sealed inside that dimensional pocket 3 weeks ago, the Fuel Society artifact her handlers had been tracking for months. It had reacted to Rayne's contact like a detonator meeting a trigger. One moment, she had been reaching for the artifact's containment case, the next, Gotham. Not New Orleans, not any city she recognized. She pressed her back against the tenement wall and extended her senses outward the way her training had taught her, letting the dhampir half of her blood do what it was built for. She could smell 17 humans within a 100-meter radius, 5 of them frightened, 2 of them carrying weapons recently fired, one of them something else entirely. Something cold and deliberate that moved across the rooftop above her with the confidence of someone who owned the dark. Rayne looked up. The figure was already looking down. Batman descended without theater, no grapnel flourish, no dramatic cape spread, just controlled movement and the particular quality of silence that belongs to people who have made silence into a weapon. He landed 8 feet from her, and Rayne registered the details the way she registered everything. 6'2", 210 pounds of trained muscle beneath armor that was better than it looked, eyes behind white lenses that gave nothing away, a posture that communicated absolute certainty without needing to perform it. He had been watching her for longer than she'd been aware of him. That alone told her something important about who she was dealing with. "You came through the rift," he said. "Observant," Rayne said. "Is that considered a power here?" The lenses didn't blink. "Your biosignature is registering as partially human, elevated cellular regeneration, retractable forearm blades, custom composite, not Wayne, not LexCorp. Your pupils dilated to process light at approximately 40 times the normal human capacity when you entered the alley. You fed within the last 6 hours. Not from anyone in this alley." Rayne slowly extended to her full height, making no move to retract the blades. "And yet you're still standing 8 feet away instead of trying to detain me. Why?" "Because the 3 men in this alley were fed on by something that isn't you," Batman said. "Different puncture radius, different vascular collapse pattern. Whatever this was, it was here before you arrived." He took 1 step forward, not threatening, assessing. "Which means Gotham already had a problem. You're a separate variable." "I'm going to need a better word than variable." "You'll get one when I decide what you are." Rayne held his gaze for a moment, reading him the way she had learned to read every man who had ever looked at her like a problem to be solved. Most of them had underestimated what solving her would cost. This one, she suspected, had already run the numbers and arrived at a figure that gave even him pause. She respected that enough to sheathe one blade. Just one. "Rayne," she said, "Brimstone Society, I hunt things that shouldn't exist." The white lenses held their expression. "So do I," Batman said. "Welcome to Gotham. Try not to kill anyone I haven't cleared." She almost smiled at that. Almost. The three unconscious men were transported to Gotham General within 12 minutes. Batman's efficiency so absolute it felt choreographed. He didn't explain how he'd called it in without a visible communication device. He didn't explain the black vehicle that materialized from a side street like a shadow given mechanical form. He simply moved through Gotham's infrastructure, the way blood moves through a body, with the implicit authority of something that belongs there. And Rayne found herself matching his pace through Coventry's back streets, which told her more about her own instincts than she was entirely comfortable with. The Batcave, when he brought her to it, was exactly the kind of place she would have built if she had a billionaire's budget and a dead child's grief driving every architectural decision. Vast and cold and obsessively organized, the hum of servers filling the darkness below the stalactites, the costume cases lit like altars. She stood at the edge of the platform and looked down at the cave's depths and felt, for the first time since the rift, something that wasn't combat readiness. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. "You sealed the rift that brought me here," Batman said, already at the computer, fingers moving across holographic displays with the casual fluency of long practice. Trace signature matches a dimensional pocket sealed by Zatanna Zatara 6 weeks ago. The artifact inside was Thule Society, pre-war German occult, modified with something that doesn't match any known mystical tradition in my database. He pulled up the energy signature, violet and copper against the black display. Rayne stared at the signature, the trace of her own crossing. "The artifact reacted to my bloodline," she said. "Dhampir, half vampire, half human. The Thule had been trying to engineer something using mixed blood carriers for decades. I should have been more careful making contact." "You should have," Batman agreed, without particular judgment. "What does the Brimstone Society do with artifacts like that?" "Destroys them, or contains them until destruction is viable. We're not gentle about it." Batman was quiet for a moment, assembling something behind those lenses that she couldn't read. "Gotham has a vampire problem," he finally said. "Has had one intermittently for 30 years. Most recently it's been dormant, the network fragmented after a significant disruption 18 months ago. But 3 weeks ago the feeding pattern started again. Different methodology, more organized." He turned from the display to look at her directly. "Your arrival may not be a coincidence." Rayne felt the familiar cold settling into her chest, the one that had lived there since childhood, since she had first understood what her father had made her into and what she would spend her life doing about it. Someone had been moving pieces before she even knew she was on the board. "It never is," she said quietly. Outside, Gotham's rain continued its ancient argument with the city's rooftops. Somewhere in Coventry, in the tunnels beneath the condemned tenements where the streetlights flickered in patterns that weren't a malfunction, something very old and very hungry adjusted its timeline in response to the new variable the universe had just introduced. It had been waiting for a dhampir. It simply hadn't expected this one. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The Batcave's servers ran a continuous analysis on Rayne's biology for the next 4 hours, and Batman let her watch him do it. That was its own kind of message, not the surveillance which she had expected, but the transparency of it. He wasn't hiding that he was cataloging her. He was showing her that he cataloged everything, that she was not special in her suspicion, that the white lenses turned this same cold precision on everyone who entered his world, including, she suspected, the people he trusted most. It was the most honest thing about him, and paradoxically, the thing that made her trust him the smallest degree more than she had trusted anyone in a very long time. Dhampir physiology is documented in my database, he said, pulling up a file that contained more accurate information about her biology than the Brimstone Society's own medical records. Andrew Bennett's scandal in the vampire community roughly 20 years ago. Madame Xanadu has consulted on several cases. Your cellular structure matches the theoretical model, but your regenerative capacity exceeds it by approximately 30%. That's not normal even for your kind. My father wasn't a normal vampire, Rayne said flatly. He was something older. The Brimstone Society spent 15 years trying to classify him before they gave up and just classified me instead. Batman absorbed this without visible reaction, which she was beginning to understand was simply his default state rather than deliberate stoicism. Your blades, he said. The harness design suggests military modification over a long period, not manufactured, evolved. You've been adjusting them for decades. Since 1943, she said. You get particular about your tools when they're the only thing standing between you and being someone's dinner. 1943, he turned from the display. How old are you? Old enough to have met men who thought that question was charming. She met the lenses without expression. Old enough to have outlived all of them. He accepted this with a single nod and returned to the display. The analysis had reached her bloodwork, and Rayne watched the chemical breakdown scroll across the holographic screen with detached interest. She had seen her own blood under microscopes before. It always looked like an argument between two incompatible systems that had somehow learned to function despite their fundamental disagreement. Human and vampire, coexisting at the cellular level through sheer biological stubbornness. Constantine needs to see you, Batman said. Rayne had heard the name twice since her arrival, both times carrying the specific weight of words that are not quite warnings but want to be. Who is Constantine? Batman was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he was editing a longer answer into something manageable. He's the foremost authority on supernatural phenomena in this city and possibly this reality. He's also completely untrustworthy, will attempt to manipulate you within 30 seconds of meeting you, and is somehow always right about the things that matter. Don't shake his hand without knowing why he's offering it. I like him already, Rayne said. They met Constantine at a pub in the Narrows called the Broken Halo, which Rayne suspected had been named ironically, and had since grown into its name with the particular commitment of places that have absorbed too much supernatural traffic to pretend otherwise. The smell hit her at the threshold, old beer and cigarette smoke, and beneath both of those something else, something that had soaked into the walls over years of conversations that shouldn't have been held in rooms with ceilings. The smell of deals made and debts unpaid, and knowledge that cost more than the people carrying it had expected when they went looking for it. Constantine was already at a corner table, a cigarette burning between his fingers, a glass of something amber in front of him that he wasn't drinking. He was blond, rumpled, wearing a trench coat that looked like it had survived more apocalypses than its dry-cleaning receipt suggested, and he had the eyes of someone who had seen the punchline of every joke the universe told, and had stopped finding any of them funny approximately 15 years ago. He looked at Rayne, and the cigarette stopped moving. Oh, he said, in the tone of a man who had just opened a bill he'd been deliberately avoiding. That's not good. Charming, Rayne said, taking the chair across from him without being invited. She knows about the handshake thing, Batman said, settling into the third chair with the air of someone attending a meeting they've been dreading. Constantine studied Rayne with the focused attention of a man reading a document in a language he knows but doesn't enjoy. His eyes moved across her face, her hands, the faint luminescence her amber irises carried in low light, and she could see him assembling a picture that was clarifying something he'd already suspected. He took a long drag of the cigarette, exhaled slowly, and pointed at her with the hand holding it. "You're not from here," he said. "Established," Rayne replied. "No, love. I mean you're not from any reality that borders this one in any way I recognize. Your supernatural signature is completely foreign, not dark multiverse, not Earth 3, not any of the 52 I've had the misfortune of developing a working knowledge of." He tapped ash onto the floor with the casual disregard of a man who had never once worried about security deposits. "The vampiric element in your blood isn't connected to Cain's bloodline, not Dracula's line, not Andrew Bennett's sire chain. It's something entirely outside DC's infernal hierarchy." "Which means DC's hell doesn't recognize her," Batman finished. Constantine pointed at him without looking away from Rayne. "Which means DC's hell doesn't recognize her. Which means every demon, every infernal contract, every supernatural authority in this reality that operates through bloodline hierarchy," he leaned forward, "has absolutely no idea what to do with you. You're a foreign object in a very carefully organized supernatural body, and foreign objects get noticed," Rayne said quietly. "Get noticed," Constantine confirmed, "by things that don't like surprises." He finally picked up his glass, looked at it, and set it back down. "Something is moving in Gotham's vampire network. Been building for 3 weeks, which is right around when whatever brought you here first started destabilizing. I've been watching the feeding patterns, the territorial shifts, the way the older nests have been consolidating instead of competing." He looked at Batman. "Someone's been organizing them. And they're not doing it through fear or strength." He looked back at Rayne. "They're doing it through a ritual, a summoning that requires very specific blood." The broken halo's walls absorbed the silence that followed with the practiced patience of a place that had heard worse. "Dhampir blood," Rayne said. "It wasn't a question." "Not just any dhampir," Constantine said. "Blood from a dhampir whose vampiric lineage exists outside DC's infernal framework. Blood that the hierarchy can't trace, can't counter, can't contain within its existing supernatural laws." He finally lit another cigarette from the dying ember of the first. "Someone in this reality's vampire underground knew you were coming, or they knew something like you was possible, and they built the ritual to pull you here." He exhaled smoke toward the stained ceiling. "Either way, your arrival wasn't an accident." Rayne felt the old cold in her chest expand, filling the spaces between her ribs with the familiar weight of being. Once again, the instrument someone else had designed a plan around. Her father had built her for his purposes. The Brimstone Society had repurposed her for theirs. And now, apparently, something in a reality she hadn't known existed 3 hours ago had arranged for her extraction from her own universe, with the calm efficiency of people who had been planning for contingencies she hadn't known to anticipate. She thought about the Thule artifact, the way it had reacted to her touch. The violet and copper of the dimensional rift were so precise for something that was supposed to be an accident. "The artifact wasn't Thule," she said slowly. "The Thule were carrying it, they didn't make it." Constantine and Batman exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation she wasn't party to. "No," Constantine said. "They weren't clever enough to make something like that. Someone gave it to them. Someone who needed a delivery mechanism that a Brimstone operative would inevitably intercept." He stood, pulling the trenchcoat around him with the air of a man preparing for whether he already knows is terrible. "Welcome to Gotham, love. Someone here went to extraordinary lengths to get you, and they haven't introduced themselves yet, which means they're not done setting the table." He dropped a card on the table, a phone number scrawled on the back of what appeared to be a dry-cleaning receipt. "When it goes sideways, not if when, call that number." He walked toward the door, paused, and looked back over his shoulder. "And try not to feed on anyone Batman hasn't cleared," he said, with the ghost of something that might have been a smile on a different face. "He gets very particular about that." The door swung shut behind him. Rayne looked at Batman across the table's scarred wood, rainwater still drying in her hair, the cold in her chest now carrying the specific texture of a mission that had found her rather than the other way around. "How bad is your vampire problem?" she asked. Batman placed a file on the table. Photographs, maps, feeding pattern analysis, the kind of documentation that represented weeks of meticulous work assembled with the grim thoroughness of a man who prepared for everything precisely, because preparation was the only thing standing between Gotham and the abyss it perpetually leaned toward. "It's about to become significantly worse," he said. The vampire underground of Gotham City was not, Rayne discovered, the disorganized collection of territorial predators she had spent decades hunting across Europe and South America. Those networks operated on hunger and hierarchy, the oldest and strongest at the top, the newly turned scrambling beneath them in a chaos of competing appetites that made them predictable. Predictable things were manageable things. What Batman's files described was something categorically different, a structured organization with cells, communication protocols, resource management, and what could only be described as a long-term strategic vision. Someone had taken Gotham's fractured vampire community and turned it into an apparatus. The methodology wasn't predatory. It was institutional. Rayne spread the photographs across the Batcave's analysis table and studied them the way she had studied enemy positions in wartime, building a three-dimensional map in her mind of movement patterns and territorial claims, and the negative space between documented incidents where something was deliberately not leaving evidence. 37 feeding sites across 9 Gotham boroughs over 3 weeks. Not random. The sites formed a geometric pattern when mapped, a configuration she recognized from Brimstone Society training as a preparation diagram, the kind of spatial arrangement used to prime an area for ritual work, the way a surgeon primes skin before cutting. "They're preparing the city," she said. Batman stood beside her, looking at the same map with the focused stillness of a man who had already reached this conclusion, but wanted to hear her reasoning independently. "Yes. The feeding sites aren't about hunger. They're anchor points. Each one marks a location where blood has been spilled ritually, not consumed. The victim survived, which means the intent wasn't to feed. It was marking." She traced the geometric lines between sites with one finger, feeling the pattern resolve into clarity the way patterns always did when she stopped looking at the individual points and started looking at what connected them. "This is a binding diagram. Continental scale in my experience, but compressed into a city's geography." She looked at him. "What's at the center?" Batman pulled up the city map overlay. The geometric center of the pattern fell on a location in Old Gotham, the pre-war district, where the city's original architecture still stood beneath decades of urban accretion like bones beneath skin. The building at the precise center was a deconsecrated church that the city's records listed as condemned. Ownership transferred 17 times in 40 years through a chain of shell companies that Batman's analysis had partially unwound. "The Sanctum Carceris," Batman said. "Pre-colonial construction. The historical record is deliberately obscured, but Constantine identified the architectural signatures as consistent with early European occult practice brought to the Americas in the 1600s. The building has been used for supernatural purposes at least 4 times in documented Gotham history." He paused. Each time, something was being contained rather than summoned. Rayne stared at the building's location on the map, or was being prepared to contain something. "Yes." She straightened and turned to face him fully, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt the specific kind of clarity that came when a mission's shape became visible, when the chaos of new information organized itself around a central truth that had been present from the beginning, but obscured by the noise of unfamiliar context. Someone had pulled her through a dimensional rift into a reality she had never known existed. They had done it using an artifact engineered to respond to her specific bloodline. They had been preparing Gotham for 3 weeks before her arrival, marking the city with a binding diagram centered on a building, designed to contain something rather than summon it. They weren't trying to summon a demon using her blood. They were trying to contain one. And they needed her blood to do it because the thing they were trying to contain existed outside DC's infernal hierarchy, the same way she did. "The demon they're trying to bind," she said slowly. "It's from my reality." Batman was quiet for precisely 2 seconds, which she had already learned was his version of visible surprise. "Explain." "The fuel artifact. It didn't just pull me here, something came with me. Through the same rift, using the same dimensional tier, except it came through first and the artifact was the door and I was the key." She moved back to the photographs, pulling the earliest incident reports, the ones from the first night. "Your first feeding incident 3 weeks ago in Coventry. That's the night I arrived. But the feeding happened 6 hours before my rift opened." She looked at him. "Something from my reality has been in Gotham for 3 weeks. Something that needed the vampire network organized and the city primed before I got here." "Because you're the only thing that can stop it," Batman said. "My blood is the binding agent. The ritual Constantine identified. It doesn't work without dhampir blood from outside DC's supernatural framework. Whatever this thing is, it anticipated that I would eventually come through, so it built the infrastructure to exploit my arrival for its own containment." The cold in her chest now carries a new quality, something that was almost admiration despite itself. Or someone built the infrastructure on its behalf. Something this organized doesn't arrange its own containment. Batman had already moved to the computer. His fingers worked the display with the efficiency of a man eliminating possibilities in real time, cross-referencing the shell company ownership chains against Gotham's known supernatural actors, running Constantine's infernal hierarchy database against the building records, pulling surveillance footage from the old Gotham district with the systematic thoroughness of someone who trusted process above intuition, because process had never once lied to him. "Andrew Bennett," he said after 4 minutes of silence. Rayne crossed to the display. The face it showed her was angular, pale in the way that wasn't quite human, with eyes that carried the specific weight of centuries behind them. Not the emptiness of the predator, but something more complex. The exhausted moral awareness of a being that had lived long enough to understand the cost of every choice it had ever made. "DC's original vampire," Batman said. "Andrew Bennett turned Mary, Queen of Blood, in 1591. She spent 3 centuries building an army of the undead with the goal of vampire world domination. He spent 3 centuries hunting her down and stopping her. He has been the primary stabilizing force in DC's vampire community for decades, not through power, but through moral authority. The other vampires don't follow him because they fear him. They follow him because he's the only one of them who has consistently chosen restraint over appetite for 400 years. And he's organizing the network," Rayne said. "He's organizing the network," Batman confirmed. "Which means he knows what came through the rift, and he decided that organizing Gotham's vampire community into a ritual apparatus was the appropriate response." He turned from the display. "He didn't tell me." The particular quality of Batman's silence in that moment was something Rayne recognized from her own experience. The silence of someone recalibrating their understanding of a person they thought they knew, updating their model of trustworthiness with new information that didn't invalidate the previous assessment, but complicated it significantly. Andrew Bennett had made a unilateral decision to prepare Gotham for a supernatural threat without informing the city's primary protector. That was either profound arrogance or the decision of someone who believed the information would be more dangerous than the threat itself if it reached the wrong ears. "He knows you," Rayne said. "He calculated that telling you would create complications he couldn't afford." "He calculated correctly," Batman said, in a tone that made the acknowledgement sound like an indictment. "Which is what concerns me." He pulled on the cape with the efficiency of a man who had made the same motion 10,000 times. "We're going to the Sanctum Carceris. Just the 2 of us. Constantine is already there. He just hasn't admitted it yet." Batman moved toward the vehicle with the certainty of someone who had learned to read John Constantine's movements the way meteorologists read pressure systems, not by what the man said, but by the direction he consistently moved when he claimed to be going somewhere else. "And Bennett will be there. He's been waiting for you since the night the rift opened." Rayne followed him, checking her blades with the automatic thoroughness of long habit, feeling the dampier half of her blood sharpening toward the particular alertness that preceded violence the way the air sharpens before lightning. She thought about the thing that had come through the rift ahead of her, something from her reality, powerful enough to require this level of preparation, organized enough to arrange its own response infrastructure across 3 weeks in an unfamiliar dimension. Something that knew her well enough to engineer her arrival. The vehicle moved through Gotham's wet streets with a silence that felt deliberate, and Rayne watched the city pass beyond the reinforced windows, the rain-slicked neon, the shadows between buildings that moved with purposes that weren't wind, the particular texture of a city that had absorbed so much darkness it had started generating its own. She had hunted in bad places before, places where the ground itself remembered atrocities, and the memory had curdled into something active and malevolent. Gotham was different. Gotham wasn't haunted by its darkness. Gotham had made its peace with darkness the way an old soldier makes peace with the war that shaped them, not by forgetting it, not by overcoming it, but by learning to carry it without being destroyed. The city's darkness was structural, load-bearing, built into the architecture of the place at a level that preceded its crimes and would outlast them. She understood for the first time why the man sitting beside her had chosen it. Some weapons needed a whetstone. Some purposes needed a city that would never stop sharpening them. The sanctum carceris rose from old Gotham Street grid. Like a tooth, the city had grown around rather than built, pre-colonial stonework blackened by centuries of Gotham weather, its architecture carrying the particular wrongness of structures designed by people who understood that buildings could be made to do things beyond shelter. The gargoyles along its roofline were not decorative. Rayne recognized the positioning from Brimstone Society field manuals on European occult construction. Sentinel figures placed at specific angular intervals to create overlapping fields of supernatural surveillance, their stone eyes oriented not outward toward the street, but inward toward the building's interior, watching whatever was kept inside rather than whatever approached from without. Someone had built this place to watch its own contents. Constantine was on the front steps, exactly where Batman had predicted, smoking with the studied casualness of a man pretending he had arrived by coincidence at a location he had been moving toward with deliberate purpose for the past 2 hours. He looked up at their approach without surprise, which was itself informative. "Took you longer than I expected," he said to Batman. "I was being thorough," Batman replied. "You're always being thorough. It's your most exhausting quality." Constantine dropped the cigarette, ground it under his heel, and looked at Rayne with the focused assessment he'd worn in the broken halo, except now it carried an additional layer, something that looked almost like relief, which on Constantine's face was so unfamiliar it took her a moment to identify it. "You worked it out." "The thing that came through the rift with me," Rayne said. "You knew before we got here." "I knew the moment I saw your supernatural signature in the Narrows, a foreign vampiric bloodline outside DC's infernal hierarchy, arriving simultaneously with a 3-week-old organizing pattern in Gotham's vampire underground." He pulled his coat tighter against the rain. "That's not coincidence. That's choreography." He looked at the building's facade with an expression that combined professional respect with personal distaste. "Bennett's inside. He's been inside for 6 hours. Whatever he knows about what came through with you, he's been sitting with it alone, which means it's bad enough that he didn't want company while he thought about it." The sanctum carceris's interior was vast in the way that violated its exterior dimensions, the ceiling vaulting to a height that the building's outside walls couldn't logically accommodate, the space between floor and stone arch filled with the kind of darkness that wasn't merely the absence of light, but the presence of something that had displaced light and moved in. Along the walls, at intervals precisely matching the exterior gargoyle positions, channels had been cut into the stone and filled with a substance that had dried to the color of old rust. Not paint. Rayne's dhampir senses identified it before her conscious mind processed the visual. Blood, decades old, multiple donors, applied in layers over what she estimated was a period of centuries. "The binding work," she said quietly. 400 years of preparation, said Andrew Bennett, stepping from the shadows near the altar with the unhurried movement of a man who had learned that urgency was a resource to be conserved. He was exactly as Batman's photograph had shown him, angular and pale and carrying that exhausted moral weight in his eyes. But in person, those eyes held something the photograph hadn't captured, a specific quality of recognition when they settled on Rayne that suggested he had been building a model of her in his mind for 3 weeks and was now calibrating it against reality. "You know what I am," Rayne said. "I know what your blood represents," Bennett said, which was a more precise answer. "Dhampir lineage from outside DC's supernatural framework, a vampiric bloodline that exists beyond the reach of every infernal authority, every demonic hierarchy, every supernatural law that governs this reality's relationship between the living and the dead." He moved to the altar, where a series of documents had been arranged with archival care, manuscripts that looked centuries old alongside modern analytical notes in handwriting so precise it bordered on architectural. "In my experience, 400 years of it, the supernatural laws of this reality function because everything within them is connected to everything else through chains of origin. Cain's bloodline, the original curse, the hierarchy that descended from it." He looked at her steadily. "Your blood breaks those chains, not by opposing them, by being categorically outside them." "Which is why the binding works," Constantine said from behind Rayne, having entered the building with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent decades moving through spaces that didn't welcome him. "The thing that came through the rift with her is also outside DC's infernal hierarchy. Same origin reality, same supernatural framework, which means nothing in this reality's mystical arsenal can touch it." He moved to the manuscripts, scanning them with the speed of someone reading a language they know intimately. DC's binding rituals work by anchoring a supernatural entity to the infernal hierarchy, tethering it to the chains of origin that connect everything in this reality's supernatural ecosystem. But you can't tether something to a chain it was never part of. "Except with something that shares its origin," Batman said. He had moved to the building's perimeter, examining the blood channels with a forensic light, cataloging the preparation work with the systematic thoroughness that was his fundamental mode of engagement with every problem, regardless of how far outside his domain it fell. Her blood, same origin reality, same supernatural framework. The binding works because it uses the entity's own framework against it, anchors it to something it recognizes as native rather than something foreign. Rayne stood in the center of the sanctum carceris and let the full shape of it settle into her understanding with the cold clarity that had always been her most reliable instrument. Someone, or something, had engineered this entire sequence. The Thule artifact, her extraction from her own reality, 3 weeks of vampire network organization in a city she had never heard of, 4 centuries of preparation work in a building designed for exactly this purpose. The scale of the planning was staggering, and at the center of it, providing the mechanism that made everything else possible, was her blood. "What came through the rift with me," she said to Bennett, "you've seen it." Bennett was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone organizing language around something that resists description. 3 weeks ago, the night the dimensional disturbance first registered, I was in Coventry. I saw it before it saw me. Which is the only reason I'm standing here." He paused. "In my 4 centuries, I have encountered every significant supernatural entity that DC's reality has produced or imported. Demons, gods, cosmic abstracts, things that existed before the universe and will exist after it. I have a functional taxonomy of what frightens me and what merely concerns me. Another pause longer. This concerned me more than anything has concerned me in 4 centuries. The rain outside intensified against the sanctum's stone walls, and Rayne heard within it something that wasn't rain, a subsonic resonance, barely at the threshold of her enhanced perception, that the building's architecture was conducting from somewhere beneath the floor. The blood channels in the walls were responding to it, the dried preparation work activating at a frequency that made the air taste of copper and something older. "It knows we're here," Constantine said, his voice stripped of its habitual ironic distance, replaced by something that was simply professional assessment without performance. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the floor, tracking the resonance with senses that operated on principles different from Rayne's but arrived at the same information. "It's been monitoring the building since Bennett started the preparation work. It let him do it." He looked up. "It wants to be bound." The silence that followed contained several varieties of alarm, occupying the same space simultaneously. "Why?" Batman said, in the tone of a man who already suspects the answer will require him to revise several assumptions. "Because the binding requires her to be present and willing," Bennett said, looking at Rayne with those 4th-century eyes. "The ritual doesn't compel the dhampir. It requires voluntary participation, blood freely given, not taken. The entity cannot force the binding. It can only arrange circumstances in which the dhampir chooses to perform it." He held her gaze steadily. "Everything that has happened since the artifact was placed with the Thule Society, your extraction, your arrival, this preparation, this conversation, has been arranged by the entity itself. It engineered its own binding." Rayne looked at the manuscripts on the altar, at the blood channels in the walls, at Andrew Bennett's 4th-century eyes and John Constantine's stripped-bare professional face and Batman's absolute stillness, which she had learned meant he was processing something that required him to rebuild a significant portion of his model of the situation from the foundation. She thought about a thing powerful enough to arrange its own containment across 2 realities and 3 weeks of preparation work in an unfamiliar dimension. A thing that had chosen binding over freedom, constraint over power, because the alternative, existing unconstrained in a reality whose supernatural framework couldn't contain it, was something it had decided was unacceptable. "It's not a threat," she said slowly. "No," Bennett said. "It's a refugee." The subsonic resonance in the building's walls shifted frequency almost imperceptibly, barely enough for her dhampir senses to register, not enough for the others. But she felt it, a response, an acknowledgement. Something from her reality, something old and powerful and completely outside the supernatural laws of this universe, had engineered its own imprisonment in a building that had been prepared for it across 4 centuries, using a dhampir it had guided through a dimensional rift, because the alternative was existing in a reality that had no framework to accommodate it. It hadn't come to Gotham to threaten. It had come to Gotham to be saved. The entity had no name that translated. Bennett had tried, during his 3 weeks of preparation work, to find a designation in DC's supernatural taxonomy that fit it, working through every infernal dictionary and mystical codex in his 4th-century personal archive, and had arrived at nothing closer than a description. A consciousness so old it predated the conceptual framework that DC's reality used to organize the supernatural, a being that had existed in Rayne's origin reality as something between a force of nature and a governing principle, the way gravity is both a law and a presence. It had not been malevolent. It had not been benevolent. It had simply been vast and ancient and self-contained, until the Thule Society's dimensional experimentation had cracked the wall between realities, and the crack had become a breach, and the breach had become something that pulled at the entity's edges with the inexorable pressure of a vacuum drawing an atmosphere. It had come through because it had no choice. The dimensional breach had destabilized its existence in its own reality, the way removing a keystone destabilizes an arch. The structure doesn't fall immediately, but the failure is already written into the physics of the situation. Remaining in its original reality meant dissolution. Coming through meant exile in a universe whose supernatural framework had no category for it, no chain of origin to anchor it, no infernal hierarchy to regulate its presence. Unconstrained in DC's reality, it would not be malevolent. It would simply be incompatible, a foreign supernatural mass that DC's mystical ecosystem would eventually begin organizing defensive responses against. The way an immune system responds to something it cannot identify, with escalating force regardless of whether the foreign body poses an actual threat. Rayne stood at the Sanctum Carceris altar and listened to Bennett explain this with the focused patience of a man who had spent 3 weeks preparing a presentation he hoped would be received with something better than outright refusal, and she felt the cold in her chest doing something it had not done in a very long time. It was not warming. She did not warm easily, had not since childhood, but it was shifting, the familiar weight of being someone else's instrument reorganizing itself around a different emotional center. Not resentment, something more complicated. The entity had engineered its own salvation, using the only instrument available to it, a dhampir from the same origin reality, whose blood could perform a binding that DC's supernatural framework couldn't. It had arranged everything, the artifact, the rift, Bennett's preparation work, this conversation, with the careful desperation of a being running out of time and options, and it had done so without coercion, without deception about its ultimate intent, engineering circumstances that would bring Rayne here and give her the full information, and then leave the choice entirely to her. Because the binding required willing participation, because it could not force this. "It's been honest with us," she said. "As far as we can determine," Constantine said, from his position near the wall where he had been examining the blood channels with a combination of professional analysis and personal wariness that suggested he found the entity's behavior more unsettling than straightforward malevolence would have been. Which is, frankly, the most disturbing thing about it. In my experience, supernatural entities of this magnitude don't engineer their own imprisonment through transparent means and voluntary binding rituals. He turned from the wall. They conquer, or they destroy, or they manipulate. He gestured at the manuscripts, the preparation work, the geometric precision of everything Bennett had assembled, file paperwork. "It's not malevolent," Batman said. He had been at the building's perimeter for the past 20 minutes, systematic as always, but Rayne had noticed that his examination had gradually shifted from forensic documentation to something that looked more like listening, standing at specific points along the blood channels, with the stillness of a man extending his perception beyond its normal range. The resonance pattern in the walls has a structure. It's not random supernatural energy. It's organized. He moved to the altar, looking at the manuscripts with the focused attention he gave to everything that required him to operate outside his primary domain while maintaining his fundamental methodology. It's communicating through the preparation work, has been since Bennett started. Every adjustment Bennett made to the ritual in the past 3 weeks was in response to corrections it was suggesting, Bennett said. He sat down at the altar with the careful movement of a man whose 4 centuries had not made him invulnerable to exhaustion. "I realized after the first week that I wasn't designing the ritual. I was transcribing it. The resonance would intensify or diminish in response to my work, and I learned to read the intensification as confirmation and the diminishment as error." He looked at his hand, pale, steady, the hands of someone who had made irreversible choices so long ago the weight of them had become structural. "It has been guiding its own binding with more precision and patience than anything I have encountered in 4 centuries of supernatural practice." Rayne looked at the altar and the manuscripts and the blood channels that 4 centuries of preparation had built into the sanctum's walls, and she thought about patience. She had patience. Dhampir longevity gave you patience the way chronic pain gave you endurance, not as a virtue cultivated but as an adaptation enforced. But the entity's patience was categorically different. It had watched dimensional walls crack in its own reality and calculated responses across timescales that made her century of existence look like an afternoon. It had identified the only viable solution, identified the only viable instrument, and then waited, not passively but with active, careful, precise waiting, for the instrument to arrive. "If I don't do this," she said, "what happens to it?" Constantine answered because it was the kind of question he had spent his career developing precise answers to, even when precision required saying things people found difficult to hear. DC's mystical ecosystem will eventually register it as an unclassified supernatural incursion. The Lords of Order will take notice first. They catalog everything that falls outside the established framework. Then fate gets involved, and fate's solutions to unclassified incursions are comprehensive and not particularly concerned with collateral. He paused. After that, if it's still here, Darkseid's intelligence apparatus on Apocalypse will detect the anomaly, something outside the infernal hierarchy, existing unconstrained in DC's reality. With power of this magnitude, is something Darkseid wants, Batman said. Is something Darkseid will attempt to weaponize, Constantine corrected, with the precision of a man making an important distinction. There's a difference. Wanting implies desire. Darkseid doesn't desire, he calculates. And he will calculate that an entity outside DC's supernatural laws, bound to nothing in this reality's framework, could be instrumentalized in ways that nothing currently in his arsenal can be. He looked at Rayne steadily. The anti-life equation works by exploiting connections within DC's infernal and emotional spectrum. Something that exists outside those connections would be immune, and in Darkseid's hands, immunity becomes a weapon. The subsonic resonance in the walls intensified briefly, not threateningly, more the way a person's breathing changes when something important is said in their presence. The entity was listening. Of course, it was listening. It had been listening to everything, guiding everything for 3 weeks. Rayne turned to face the center of the sanctum and addressed the resonance directly, because she had lived long enough to know that courtesy costs nothing and occasionally matters more than strategy. "You understand what the binding means," she said. "Permanent containment in this building. 4 centuries of preparation work hold you in place indefinitely. You engineered this. You want this. I need to understand why permanent imprisonment in an unfamiliar reality is preferable to whatever the alternative was in our own." The resonance shifted. Bennett made a sound, not surprise, more recognition, and moved quickly to the manuscripts, turning pages with focused urgency until he found what he was looking for and held it up. A page covered in the correction notations, the intensification marks he had learned to read as confirmation. The pattern of marks on this particular page was different from the others, denser, more deliberate. "It was prepared for this question," Bennett said quietly. Constantine crossed to him and read the page, and Rayne watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do in their 2 meetings. It went still in a way that wasn't his habitual world-weary composure, but something beneath that composure. The face of a man encountering something that cost him his ironic distance. He read it twice, then set it down with a care that felt like respect. "What does it say?" Batman said. Constantine looked at Rayne. In its own reality, it was a governing principle, a force that maintained the structural integrity of the supernatural framework, the equivalent of DC's source wall, the boundary condition that kept everything else stable. He paused. When the Thule breach cracked the dimensional wall, it didn't just destabilize the entity's existence. It destabilized the framework that the entity was maintaining. Coming through the breach didn't just save the entity. He stopped. "It saved my reality," Rayne said. By removing itself from an equation, it had become a destabilizing variable in, yes. Constantine picked up his cigarette case, looked at it, and put it away without taking one, which Rayne was beginning to understand was his version of a significant emotional response. It sacrificed its existence in its own reality, its freedom, its agency, everything it was, to prevent its own presence from destroying the framework it had spent its existence maintaining. And then it engineered its containment here because dissolution wasn't acceptable. An unconstrained existence in DC's reality would eventually produce the same destabilizing effect it had fled. He looked at her. It needed a prison. It needed a prison whose bars were made of something it recognized as native. And you're the only source of that material in this reality. Rayne was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Gotham's rain continued its perpetual argument with the city's stone and steel, and the sanctum carceris breathed its 4th-century breath around them, and the subsonic resonance waited with the patience of something that had already demonstrated it could wait across timescales that dwarfed every human and vampiric concern in the room. She thought about her father, who had used her existence for his own purposes without her consent. She thought about the Brimstone Society, which had repurposed that existence for theirs with her consent, but not her full understanding. She thought about every mission she had undertaken in service of something larger than herself, the long, cold arithmetic of sacrifice that had been the fundamental currency of her life since 1933. She thought about a being that had chosen imprisonment over freedom, containment over power, exile over dissolution, because the alternative was watching everything it had spent its existence protecting collapse in its wake. She recognized that arithmetic. She had been living it for nearly a century. "What do I need to do?" she said. Bennett stood. Constantine moved to the altar's left side. Batman took a position at the perimeter that was simultaneously tactical and respectful, the stance of a man standing witness to something outside his domain, while maintaining his responsibility for what occurred within his city. The blood channels in the sanctum's walls began to glow with a light that was neither warm nor cold, but simply present, activated by the proximity of what they had been built across 4 centuries to receive. Rayne drew her blade and made the cut across her palm with the practiced efficiency of someone who had bled for purposes both chosen and unchosen across a very long life, and felt her dhampir blood meet the air of DC's reality and recognized, in the resonance that answered it, immediate, vast, and suffused with something that translated imperfectly across the barrier between supernatural frameworks, but arrived in her chest as unmistakably, overwhelmingly grateful, that this time at least, the purpose had been worth the cost. She pressed her bleeding palm to the altar stone and spoke the words Bennett had prepared, and the sanctum carceris did what 4 centuries of work had built it to do, and the entity from her reality found, in the stone and blood and careful architecture of a city that had always known how to hold darkness without being destroyed by it, something it had crossed dimensional walls and sacrificed its existence to find. A place it could rest. The glow in the blood channels reached its apex and held for 3 seconds, and then settled into a steady luminescence that felt permanent in the way that load-bearing structures feel permanent, not decorative, not temporary, but built into the physics of the place at a level that would outlast every person currently standing in it. The resonance stilled. In the silence that followed, Gotham's rain sounded almost gentle. "It's done," Bennett said. Rayne closed her hand around the cut and felt her dhampir healing begin its work, and stood in the quiet of the sanctum carceris with the particular feeling she had learned to recognize across decades of completed missions. Not triumph, never quite triumph, but the specific exhausted satisfaction of a thing done correctly at appropriate cost, the feeling of an equation resolved. Constantine lit a cigarette. Batman was already at his communicator, updating his files with the systematic thoroughness that was his most consistent quality. Bennett stood at the altar with his 4th-century eyes closed, and on his face was an expression Rayne had not expected to see there. Peace, temporary, hard won, and entirely real. She looked at the glowing channels in the sanctum's walls and thought about her reality, stable now in ways it hadn't been 3 hours ago, protected by a sacrifice she had been the instrument of without ever being asked to be a weapon. She thought about the dimensional rift that had closed behind her, and the reality she could not return to, and the city of rain and shadows and load-bearing darkness that had received her with the pragmatic hospitality of a place that had always made room for one more monster trying to do right by the world. She was in Gotham now. She was in DC's reality, with its gods and its dark nights and its cosmic wars and its infernal hierarchies that had no category for her. She was outside every chain of origin that organized the supernatural landscape of this universe, unclassified and unanchored and entirely herself. She sheathed her blade. In the shadows of apocalypse, something in Darkseid's intelligence apparatus registered the brief dimensional anomaly that had flickered and resolved in a city called Gotham, a supernatural signature outside every known framework, present for 3 weeks and now contained, but not before it had been noted, not before the dhampir bloodline that had performed the binding had been catalogued. Darkseid did not desire, he calculated. And his calculation, processed through the cold arithmetic of a god who thought in terms of universal dominion, assigned a value to the foreign bloodline that had performed a binding his entire infernal apparatus could not replicate. A value worth investigating. In the sanctum carceris, Rayne felt nothing of this. She stood in the quiet and let Gotham's rain speak its ancient language against the stone, and understood, with the clarity of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the shape of a beginning, that the mission that had found her was far from finished. The immediate crisis was resolved, the entity was safe, her reality was stable. But she was still here, still outside every supernatural framework this universe had built, still carrying blood that could do things DC's mystical arsenal couldn't. And Gotham, she was learning, never ran short of things that needed doing. The sanctum carceris stood quiet in old Gotham's rain-washed streets, its blood channels glowing with the steady permanence of something finally, after 4 centuries of preparation, at rest. Rayne emerged into the downpour with the particular orientation of someone who has completed one chapter and can feel the next one already assembling itself in the dark ahead. Batman walked beside her without speaking, which she had come to understand was his version of companionship, presence without performance, the acknowledgement that some things didn't require words to be real. Constantine had already disappeared into Gotham's night with the practiced efficiency of a man who treated exits as strategic assets. Bennett remained inside with his manuscripts and his 4 centuries and the quiet of a purpose fulfilled, at least temporarily. "You're staying," Batman said. It wasn't a question. "I can't go back," Rayne said. "The rift closed. My reality is stable, which means the breach that made the crossing possible no longer exists." She looked at Gotham's skyline, the gargoyles and the rain-blurred neon and the shadows that moved with purposeful intelligence between the buildings. And even if it hadn't closed, finding the honest answer beneath the practical one. "I'm outside your supernatural framework, unclassified, unanchored. In this city, that means I can go places and do things that nothing in your existing arsenal can." She looked at him directly. "You'd be wasting a resource." Batman was quiet for a moment. "You're not a resource." "I know," she said, "but I'm also not wrong." The ghost of something moved across his expression, not quite a smile, more the acknowledgement that she had said something true in a way that he respected. He reached into his utility belt and produced a communicator, small, matte black, the Wayne Industries signature of something built to survive conditions that would destroy lesser equipment. He held it out. She took it, examined it, pocketed it. "Gotham's vampire network is still organized," he said. "Bennett's ritual dismantled the binding diagram, but the infrastructure remains. 37 cells across 9 boroughs, communication protocols and resource management. Without the entity's purpose driving it, that organization is going to fragment and compete, and the feeding patterns will resume within weeks." He paused. "Someone needs to manage that transition." Someone who the network can't classify within their existing hierarchy, Rayne said. Someone outside the chains of origin. Someone who reads as neither human prey nor vampire authority. She understood. Someone they don't have a response protocol for. Yes. She looked at Gotham's darkness and felt it looking back with the evaluating attention of a city deciding whether to accept a new resident or merely tolerate one. She had been tolerated in many places across her long life. She had been accepted into very few. She thought she might be willing to work for this one. Above them, somewhere in the gargoyle-studded heights of the Sanctum Carceris, the building's stone sentinel figures maintained their inward watch over what they contained, steady and permanent as the 4 centuries that had built them toward this purpose. The blood channel's glow was invisible from the street, but Rayne's amber eyes caught the faintest luminescence through the building's high windows, warm and constant, the light of something finally, after displacement and sacrifice, and the long patience of a being that had crossed dimensional walls to find a place that could hold it at rest. Gotham received its monsters and its heroes and the impossible things that fell between those categories, with the pragmatic inclusivity of a city that had learned, over centuries of darkness and survival, that the most important question was never what you were. It was what you did with it. Rayne walked into the rain, and Gotham's shadows opened to receive her, and somewhere in the city's vast and watchful darkness, in the vampire networks and the supernatural hierarchies and the infernal undercurrents that ran beneath its streets like a second river, something shifted, a new presence registering, unclassified and unanchored, carrying blood that belonged to no chain of origin this reality had ever mapped. A new variable, a new shadow. And on Apocalypse, in the cold intelligence apparatus of a god who thought in terms of universal dominion, a file was opened, a dhampir bloodline catalogued, a value assigned. The immediate crisis had ended, but in the mathematics of Darkseid's ambition, endings were merely the intervals between calculations. The darkness of Gotham had gained a new guardian. Whether that guardian was prepared for what the darkness would eventually send in response remained, as all genuinely important questions do, to be determined. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. More stories await.